Buenos días a todos. Vamos a entrar en la segunda mesa o segunda sesión o segundo panel del Congreso y va a ser una sesión bilingüe, como ustedes saben por el programa. Vamos a empezar entonces sin más dilación con la primera comunicante. Coming from the University of Birmingham, she's a PhD student, and she's going to speak about trends in the performance history of madness in major London and Royal History Company productions of Hamlet. When you went.
Using the example of the stage history of Royal Shakespeare Company and professional London productions of Hamlet from 1959 to 2016, I intend to show how developments in British psychiatric care and society's responses to these developments have been reflected, challenged, and analysed through the medium of theatre. My research goes back to 1959 because the first of two major mental health acts was passed in this year. This act helped pave the way to deinstitutionalisation, which occurred through the 1980s and 1990s. During this time, hospital care for mental health patients was gradually replaced by a care in the community system. Of the 129 Victorian asylums in England and Wales, 124 of these were still open and in use in 1983. However, by 2005, all but 28 had closed, and many of those remaining hospitals have closed since 2005. With deinstitutionalisation, the representations of madness in productions of Hamlet changed. This was not an exact linear process, with each production falling neatly into a clear pattern illustrating the progression of knowledge and thought on mental illness. But by the 21st century, the ways in which madness was staged in RSC and major London productions of Hamlet was notably different to theatrical interpretations before the second major Mental Health Act in 1983. Michel Foucault called madness a social construct which differs from the realities of mental illness. By the 1960s in Britain, it seems that this social construct was increasingly becoming driven by the rapidly developing understandings of mental illness, and consequently in productions of Hamlet, the concepts of madness and mental illness were intertwining. In the 1960s, psychiatrist R.D. Laing posited of Ophelia that she is latterly undoubtedly a schizophrenic. In her madness, there is no one there. There is no integral selfhood expressed through her actions or utterances. Incomprehensible statements are said by nothing. She has already died. There is only a vacuum where there was once a person. Feminist theorist Elaine Showalter's criticism of Laing in 1985 was that despite his sympathy for Ophelia, Lang's readings silence her, equate her with nothing. Showalter does not dispute Lang textually. Instead, she highlights the importance of theatrical realization over the text, positing that Ophelia does have a story to tell. It is neither her life story nor her love story, but rather the history of her representation. In my research, I seek to support Showalter's theory by proving that the history of Ophelia's and also Hamlet's representations of madness hold the possibility for richer and more varied understanding of the play than textual analysis alone. My research also seeks to further Showalter's theories by following the trends she explores beyond her 1985 publication into the 21st century, and also by drawing direct and specific connections between developments occurring in society and the consequently varying theatrical interpretations that these social changes inspired, providing in particular an exploration of how preferences and expectations of critics changed regarding the options and possibilities of staging madness as deinstitutionalisation developed in Britain. Between 1959 and 1983, it was rare for London and RSC productions of Hamlet to engage directly with the medical realities of mental illness when presenting Ophelia's madness on stage. One production which did attempt a realist depiction of mental illness during this time was performed at the Warehouse in London, now the Donmar Warehouse, in 1982 and was directed by Jonathan Miller. As well as working as an actor and director, Jonathan Miller is a qualified doctor with experience working in the field of neuropsychiatry, which is a study of effects of medications on psychiatric patients. In his 1982 production of Hamlet, Miller presented the audience with an Ophelia, played by Catherine Pogston, who exhibited many physical symptoms connected with mental illness in the early 1980s. Critics reported that this is an Ophelia who, so far from distributing rosemary and rue to the court, slurps and drools and obsessively rubs her mouth and hair. A lot of the side effects of these older mental health medications are connected to the mouth, and this could explain Pogston's Ophelia's movements. These medications can cause difficulty breathing or swallowing, tongue that sticks out of the mouth, fine worm-like tongue movements, uncontrollable rhythmic face, mouth, or jaw movements. It seems that the audiences were not quite ready to see an Ophelia whose madness they assessed to be more clinical than theatrical. John Shrapnel, who played Claudius in Miller's production, remembered of Ophelia's mad scene that it aroused strange nervy reactions in our audiences. And the critical responses showed little appreciation of this display of the sort of behaviour which at the time would usually have been kept behind the walls of mental hospitals. Mary Zenett Mayer called it a medically graphic mad scene by Ophelia whose clinical insanity offended some critics and drew horrified responses from others. The negative opinions towards this portrayal of madness can be seen in the reviews of two major newspaper critics. Michael Billington enjoyed Pogston's portrayal of Ophelia's poleaxed infatuation with Hamlet, but still felt that her mad scenes are excessively clinical. And Benedict Nightingale commented that the girl said to turn madness to favour and to prettiness becomes a distressing piece of clinical observation from the locked ward of a subnormality hospital. These reviews both demonstrate a belief from the critics that madness as a theatrical construct should be different from the realities of mental illness. It seems that neither of them had expected to see Ophelia's mad scenes played in a way that they found medically convincing, and they were not comfortable with it. Although it is untrue that every Ophelia followed the theatrical tradition of well-behaved madness in which she turns everything to favour and prettiness until 1983, as proved by Miller's production, this used to be a far more common reading of the scene than it has been since the 1980s. J.C. Trewin first saw Hamlet in 1922 and commented of the Ophelia in this production that in her madness, she followed the tradition of all well-brought-up girls. She wore a wreath carefully adjusted. She carried a florist's posy of rosemary, pansies, fennel, columbines, and rue. She sang discreetly in tune, and presently she left to become, in the Queen's speech, an Academy picture by Millet. Not that every actress was like this, but there was a routine mad girl act that for years audiences inured to it accepted without comment. It would be a shock when, in our post-war theatre, Ophelia began to go genuinely mad. Even though a trend of realistic depictions of Ophelia's madness was developing by the 1950s, the tradition mentioned by Trewin of well-behaved and pretty madness persisted from 1959 to 1983. In the RSC's 1960s productions of Hamlet, many of the stage directions from Ophelia's mad scenes focus on dancing, flowers, and the lute. In the RSC's 1961 production, Ophelia's main recorded movement was to dance in a circle around the stage as she sang. In the RSC's 1970 production, directed by Trevor Nunn, much of Ophelia's mad scene was focused around the lute, with abstruse annotated stage directions in the prompt script, such as hit lute, Ophelia slap lute, and Claudius attempts to touch Ophelia's hair, crossed out and replaced with lute, she back. This Ophelia also entered with flowers, as did the Ophelia in the RSC's 1975 production, directed by Buzz Goodbody. The changes in the ways in which madness was staged in Hamlet from 1983 to 2005 were rooted in the divergence of the theatrical notions of madness and mental illness, which had not usually been clearly distinguished in productions of Hamlet before. After 1983, in place of Ophelia's madness, and to some extent also elements of Hamlet's madness, theatre practitioners engaged more with clinical ideas of mental illness, a reading of madness which it seems that critics increasingly began to expect. Ophelia began to make her way out of the peripheries of performances of Hamlet between 1983 and 2005, sometimes in quite an aggressive way. A common performance choice which allowed Ophelia sometimes to outstrip her Hamlet was for Ophelia to outmad her Hamlet. The effects of this were that clinical indications of mental illness increased on stage and were presented in productions directed by people with no medical backgrounds. The critical response to clinical mental illness in Hamlet became more positive, and Ophelia's madness was increasingly driven by logic, sometimes displayed as an effect of sexual trauma or as an understandable behavior caused by grief. For his 1984 RSC Hamlet, Ron Daniels drew on the older theatrical trend of pretty singing madwomen. After Jonathan Miller's innovative psychiatric take on Ophelia in 1982, Daniels' step backwards was met with a mixed response. Nicholas Shrimpton criticized Daniels because Miller's Ophelia was a genuinely disturbing mental case, whereas Daniels' 1984 production represented a regression from Jonathan Miller's distinguished production of 1982, which gave no sign that he was even aware of these perceptive innovations. By calling it a regression, Shrimpton's criticism of this production is that it was not of its time, that Ophelias by the 1980s should not replicate the old tradition of pretty singing madwoman. According to Shrimpton, Frances Barber's Ophelia was sweetly pretty even in her madness, and delivered her songs in a ringingly operatic bel canto, and that overall it was a production more pretty than penetrating. Approaching the character of Ophelia, Barber said that, "I had a fairly traditional image of Ophelia in my mind. This invariably took on a visual image of nightgowns and flowers. But after seeing Harriet Walter play Ophelia at the Royal Court in 1980, Barber was inspired to find the courage, intelligence, and independence behind the character, an attitude met by Ron Daniels during their first discussion about the role with the words, 'Frankie, you can't play her as a feminist, it's not in the text.' Ron Daniels directed Hamlet again for the RSC in 1989, and the progression of Daniels' Ophelias is somewhat reflective of how much changed in the 1980s around the politics of mental illness. Unlike Barber, who was criticized for her old-fashioned and overly pretty portrayal of Ophelia's madness, Rebecca Sayre, who played the role in Ron Daniels' next Hamlet at the RSC in 1989, was praised by critics for playing the mad scenes with searing clinical accuracy. Ron Daniels' 1989 production of Hamlet was taken to Broadmoor Hospital, one of the few remaining high-security residential mental hospitals left in Britain, for a one-off performance, followed by a discussion and workshop between the actors, medical practitioners, and patients. The actors found that they needed to find a deeper truth to their performances of the character's madness at Broadmoor than in Stratford-upon-Avon. Rebecca Sayre said of playing Ophelia that, confronted with so much truth and respect of the people we were performing in front of, subconsciously I realized I needed 100% of my own truth to answer them. At one point during her mad scene as Ophelia, inspired by her surroundings, Rebecca Sayre instinctively clawed at her legs, digging her fingernails into her skin. This was an action she had never previously used as Ophelia, and she decided to incorporate it into her performance for the rest of the run. This spontaneous moment caught the attention of the Broadmoor audience, several of whom commented on how realistic it was, such as, "How did Ophelia know to scratch her legs like she did? All women do things like that to themselves here, cut their wrists, scratch their faces. Men hurt other people, women hurt themselves." Another instance of the female character's madness made striking beyond that of Hamlet's was Jonathan Kent's 1995 Almeida Theatre Company production. Kent took Tara Fitzgerald's Ophelia to the same self-damaging mentality with which Rebecca Sayre impressed the Broadmoor patients in 1989. Fitzgerald's Ophelia roughly cut off locks of her hair and handed them around as flowers. As well as Ophelia, Kent also highlighted Gertrude's deteriorating mental state in the second half of the play. Peter Holland wrote about Gertrude after the closet scene. On Claudius's touch, she shrieked and pulled away in revulsion, weeping but also traumatized, pulling the covers around her in a parody of decorum as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern entered. Through the second half of the play, Gertrude's ability to keep control of herself collapsed, and she quivered on the edge of madness. By the final scene, she sat with her head twitching, her makeup a terrible mask, her suffering ignored by all about her. I have never seen the consequences of Hamlet's treatment of Gertrude so graphically and horrifyingly exposed. Several critics mentioned the focus on the female character's madness in this production, and how the women were played with more realistic depictions of mental illness than Hamlet. Tara Fitzgerald sturdily affecting Ophelia loses her mind and her hair, which she cuts off in strands and calls wild flowers. Francesca Annis's sexy, full-blown Gertrude has no inkling of Claudius's crime and is unhinged by the news. And the effect of this on Hamlet was that, by comparison with the women's suffering, Hamlet's madness seemed only an actor's performance, and his treatment of them unmistakably brutal, callous, and self-regarding. These clinically driven performance choices from 1995 received a much warmer critical response than Miller's 1982 production. Since 2005, the interaction has increased further between interpretations of the psychology of self and society and the ways in which Ophelia's madness has been performed in productions of Hamlet. Examples of this are the increase in engagement with mental illness in reviews and the new involvement of psychiatrists and mental health patients in the rehearsal processes. When Catherine Pogson aimed to present an audience with a clinically schizophrenic Ophelia in Jonathan Miller's 1982 Hamlet, critics seemed to find it distasteful for an Ophelia to inhabit clinical signs of mental illness. For Miller's 2008 production, the critics found an Ophelia which they believed to be clinically accurate and also theatrically thrilling, calling her mad scene in which she stabbed a doll suggestively with twigs whilst wearing clownish makeup and a nightdress stained with blood, one of the most convincing ever staged. And yet in Michael Grandage's 2009 Hamlet, it appears that the clinical approach to Ophelia's mental illness caused her madness to go too far in the opposite direction. When preparing to play Ophelia in Grandage's production at the Wyndham's Theatre in London, Gugu Mbatha-Raw consulted a psychiatrist to help her interpret Ophelia's madness as an accurate depiction of mental illness. With this psychiatrist, she discussed grief and trauma with a particular interest in how people react to extreme situations. Mbatha-Raw said of the mad scenes that I think the danger with madness is that you act mad, and that's not real to me. This is a girl who gets caught up in extraordinary circumstances, and wouldn't anyone be driven to the edge in those conditions? As a consequence of aiming for realism, Mbatha-Raw played Ophelia's madness as hurt and distraction, taking her Ophelia to the edges of sanity, but not committing to playing the mad scenes as a full mental breakdown. There was a lack of enthusiasm in the critics' responses to this clinically driven Ophelia. Critics mostly found this reading dull and thought that it reduced the power of the character. Her madness is reduced to a kind of demure despair. The presentation of an idealistic, innocent girl whose mind slips feels like an adjunct to the central action. Gugu Mbatha-Raw, eschewing the histrionics sometimes associated with the part, heads too far in the opposite direction towards a chilly restraint. She plays her eventual madness as flightiness, as if she'd merely misplaced her house keys. It is a difficult balance to play when an audience expects to see madness, but the actress and director decide to aim for realism, and the responses to this production draw attention to the ease with which realism can diminish madness to dullness. One striking example of the increase in clinical approaches to Ophelia in the theatre is the Royal Shakespeare Company's 2016 Hamlet, directed by Simon Godwin, with Natalie Simpson in the role of Ophelia. Two women from the mental health charity Mind came into the rehearsal room for Godwin's production of Hamlet to discuss Ophelia's madness with Natalie Simpson. Jenny Reagan, senior media advisor at Mind, wrote to the cast and production team of Hamlet that this is the first time we have worked with a theatre company, despite having worked with hundreds of dramas and soaps over the last 4 years. It is undoubtedly a good news story. Simpson was very keen to portray mental illness on stage in a way that was medically accurate and respectful, as well as theatrically exciting to watch. Finding a logical arc seems to have been crucial for Simpson. In order for Ophelia's mental breakdown to make the most sense psychiatrically, Simpson decided that her Ophelia was prone to depression from the start of the play. She worked out ways of introducing aspects of this in earlier scenes by considering everyday coping mechanisms of mental illness. Simpson said of this that, "A lot of the time you try very hard to be fine, to be okay. After the nunnery scene, she comes in and she has to sit and watch the play, and I tried to make her completely fine in that scene. I think that's actually more realistic in public, because as a woman, if you've ever been attacked in that way, the first thing they want to do is not tell anyone." Simpson and the director Simon Godwin undoubtedly put an unusually high level of thought and research into creating an Ophelia who was clinically accurate. They discussed the forms of mental illness which she planned to inhabit as Ophelia with people who have experienced these illnesses firsthand. She found a consistent and convincing logical pattern to the development of Ophelia's mental illness from her earliest scenes in the play, which credibly progressed to her mental breakdown. And she used clinical understandings of mental illness as well as observation of mental health patients to physicalize the role. This provides a stark contrast to the way that Ophelia would often be overlooked in 20th century performance, where the character often was not a central part of the story, and many directors gave little thought to how her madness should be portrayed. This attention to Ophelia did not go unnoticed by the audience. Simpson said that in response to her performance, she got a lot of tweets, mainly from young women, saying thank you for making her real, thank you for making her relatable. And she was approached by audience members after the play to thank her for the way she played the mad scenes. From these performances, it seems that madness in early to mid-20th century RSC and major London productions of Hamlet mostly followed the theatrical traditions of madness which tied back to Shakespeare's lifetime. From the middle of the 20th century, the ideas of madness and mental illness were becoming more distinct, and so they began to diverge in performance, although it was not clear which path Ophelia's madness would or should follow. After 1983, Ophelia increasingly began to follow the social ideas of mental illness, and Ophelia became more and more central to the story, and she would sometimes overtake her Hamlet in the levels of attention paid to the characters by critics and theorists. It is only over the past few years that actresses and directors have begun to consult psychiatrists or mental health patients in their preparations for a production of Hamlet in order to ensure that they portray mental illness as accurately and respectfully as possible. This research shows that developments in psychiatry which have affected society as a whole can be tracked through theatre. This is yet more evidence of the importance of theatre to unpack, interpret, and shed light on society. It is also further and deeper evidence of Showalter's feminist angle on Hamlet, which proves that Ophelia does indeed have a rich and varied story to tell. As a whole, it proves that theatrical notions of madness can morph over time to reflect changes in society, even, and perhaps particularly, in a play written hundreds of years before the concepts of psychology and psychiatry existed. Gracias.